And if the environmentalists could come to understand the necessity of switching over the taconite industry, that would be big. Um, so, what are your thoughts, and what's the political situation here?
Yeah. Uh, um, my thoughts are complex, as you might expect. I'm a columnist, which means I have the luxury of stewing on both sides of an issue and chewing on it and imagining things that no one will like and putting it in the paper anyway.
Yeah.
Um, but so I mean, first the cold facts of the economic situation facing the iron and steel industry is just that traditional taconite, which came of age in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and maybe even in the 70s, you could say was the boom, uh, is reaching the end point of its technological life. It's not done. There still are blast furnaces using taconite pellets. They still exist. They're still profitable and functional. And so they're not going away. However, the steel industry as a whole is making a very clear and definitive move towards electric arc furnaces and direct reduced iron. And as such, taconite will have a very limited role in that new and very fast growing sector of the steel industry. What they're doing in many cases is melting scrap steel to feed these new furnaces. And what they look for is direct DRI, either pellets or these HBI briquettes, these iron, basically pig iron or some version of it. And it's a different form of the same mineral, the same element, iron, but prepared differently. And you can still mine it here in northern Minnesota, and you just need to produce it and refine it differently. Well, of course, that takes a significant investment of money to make plants that do that. And there are plants that do that, but they are not currently in Minnesota. So, as you point out, it would be very logical, certainly for the industry and certainly for the region, and to the degree it supports the industry, to advocate for investment in DRI, iron briquette, pig iron style production. So that's there's everybody would say, yeah, we all agree that that's a good thing to do. It is a kind of ore production and steel production that is, I mean, can't call it carbon neutral or anything, but it is better than what we've currently done. A lot of the process is electrified, which means you can run it on any source of electricity, including renewables and things like hydro, which are very big here. So, I mean, if you look at it from an environmental standpoint, there's a reason to do it as well. So, great, right? So we all agree. Well, the problem, this is the political problem, is as you point out, there is I guess, what you might call a stalemate or a quagmire of political back and forth. It is broadly painted as the pro industry or pro mining faction versus the pro environment green faction, and that those camps exist. It's two figures staring each other down, and of course, even one tiny step to the side or toward the other is an admission of total defeat and therefore unacceptable. These are human institutions, industry or government or whatever, and as such they are as complex as humans are. And just because you might support the act of mining a mineral and using it, for instance, for something we like renewable energy, batteries, and things like that, um, we can support that, but that means we also have to trust the companies that are doing it, which means you might need to look closely at who you're working with, and you might need to need request assurances that things will be done in the way that they are promised and things of this nature. Well, all of that's kind of, if you listen to the debate, that's not any part of the discussion. There is only one discussion, which is, are you for these projects and therefore jobs in these communities, or are you against them? Conversely, Are you for a form of mining that is risky and shouldn't even be tried, or are you in support of, broadly, the boundary waters, or um, fresh water in its very essence? So both of these are classic slippery slope either or arguments that aren't reality, but that because people believe them become reality. And that's where we're stuck, is we're in the reality of our own formation. And it will take a lot more eggheads like me yelling and yelling for it to change. And I'm not expecting it to change. I think rather there will be a momentum build one way or the other, that whether it's US Steel or Cleveland Cliffs, um, they have to. US Steel in particular has to figure this out. Now they can play it cool and quiet. You don't hear much about it, but US Steel is investing in electric arc furnaces. Cliffs already has done that and is doing more of it. And they have to figure out how to rework the mining process here. They need to. What will it take? Will they need money? And this is a dangerous thing, I think, sometimes, because frankly, the money at that time in the 60s, US Steel was still a global titan, a teetering one perhaps, but still one of the biggest companies in the world. It's not even in the top 100 anymore. It's itty bitty, comparatively speaking, even among steel companies. So US Steel, to stay relevant, has to figure this out, but they're limited cost wise on what they can do. Older people in the industry itself and in the political leadership are still thinking in terms of maintaining what we've got, which is this huge supply of taconite and its development into pellets, versus the notion that we might not need all these taconite plants, but we could have a really sophisticated iron ore production facility that produces for steel mills that don't have to be located all that far away. You got the political issue, then you got the money and the economics of the whole thing, and that's one of the vexing things. Is everything involved takes money, billions of dollars, and
I'm really concerned about climate change, and blast furnaces are horrible in my view, and electric arc furnaces are not so bad. Now, uh, in my extreme environmental state, I'd say we should not mine because we should get along without it, and I'm happy to live in a stick house in the woods and freeze. That's what I think would be better, but I don't think most of us are going to do that. So I would like to compromise on this, which means I want to propose that the environmental movement get behind getting rid of blast furnaces and the coal that goes into them and going toward electric arc furnaces, and that Minnesotan environmentalists begin to press for DRI produced on the range, and I hope electric arc furnaces here, so that we could benefit economically from this thing that we've
mhm,
got, which I don't want to keep looking at these minerals as something bad. They're like, let's take a little bit of an earth-centered
normal.
approach
but
here.
but I think people are a little discombobulated by all the change we've experienced in the last few decades, and so there's this cultural, and you see it everywhere, not just in here in northern Minnesota. It's a certain kind of cultural response, protectionism of small communities, an insular focus on ourselves and our own, self-sufficiency, independence, and freedom. You're seeing a desire for organized interference of any kind, especially if it espouses complex topics, like higher learning or technology or these sorts of things. You're seeing a resistance to that kind of thing, a desire to return perhaps to a simpler, more nostalgic look at the economy and how we accomplish it. and kind of a return to values, and as the approach. But that's what's experienced here by people who are going through it here. But you're seeing a very different thing in the city and the suburbs. You're seeing, for instance, large populations of people who have gained rights and acceptance in recent years, and who still see a future that needs to change more in order for things to work well. And so there's a very emotional resistance to the traditions of society, but also traditional industry and things of that nature. The desire to, whisk away all these big messy things in our human society that we all depend upon, but that is better when you don't know about it. Kind of like hamburgers. They're great. They taste good. The less you know about where they come from, the better you're going to enjoy it. People are voting to stick it to the Twin Cities. This is grim, but like in the terrible opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, the battle scene, there's this scene where the medic is desperately trying to save a man's life, doing this field surgery, and all these guys are helping him, and they're heroically trying to save the man's life, and then a bullet hits the patient in the head, and it's like, oh, and that's kind of what I feel. This is really dark. I realize I have a dark journalistic sense of humor, but that's what I see happening with the Democrats on the range right now. Is like there's this complex, oh boy, if we just calculate it just right, and if we get it just so, they'll know that we're for all the things they like, and we still are going to support mining and all that, and it'll be fine. And indeed it would be, but you know what? No, because that's not what this is about. It's this cultural yop, to paraphrase a poem, of people just trying to express a feeling of being left out of a society, but also a fear response, an anger response, an almost revulsion to the changes of our times, and a lack of context to handle or process those changes. And so, I mean, one of the great, I think, underestimated things is how little mining really matters in what's happening electorally. It matters to some people a whole heck of a lot. Obviously, the union leaderships and the various interest groups and the small businesses who want to boost in revenue and this and that, they have a very specific vested interest. But a lot of people they're voting on this crazy Facebook stuff as much as anything else. And that its stockholders have for dividends now as opposed to dividends later.
Wow.
This is the nature of the corporation. That certainly has been true. In the early heady days of the corporation, it was broadly understood that the corporation, yes, had obligations to its stockholders, but that it had an obligation to the whole U.S. economy as well, which is as altruistic as corporations can get. They don't necessarily get down to the lower levels of the miners all the time, but they do think broadly about the economy. Well, in the Grover Norquist more aggressive corporate model thinking starting in the, I guess, 80s, and then now till now, is this just ferocious, almost zealous commitment to stockholder returns being the only and primary aim. So you say, well, hey, wait a minute. If they convert their industry to a more modern technique, they're going to last longer. They're going to make lots of money down the line. And that's all true. And you saw it. U.S. Steel last year invested or announced an investment in a new a broad array of renovations to its properties that included electric arc furnaces, and they were punished by the stock market, by the investors over the short run, because they just saw, oh, U.S. Steel's putting money into long-term future stuff, which means now is the best time to sell out. you know, because they're going to be not producing as much dividend while they're
Right.
doing this. It's
No.
money. It's you
Yeah.
know, that just like why do companies always have a stock bump when they lay off people? And the answer is because now there's money, and
Mhm.
they're so investors can get the money and the people get the pink slip.
Yeah.
Because we still have housing problems right this very instant, and we're watching property values just shoot up, especially as different economic systems are buying into the housing market. You know, there's the system of the Iron Ranger who might have grown up thinking you can buy a house for $25,000, um, and it might not be a great house, but you can live in it. Versus the reality now that you know that's enough to buy a side by side four-wheeler. It's not enough
Mhm.
to buy a house,
Mhm.
and houses are now almost exclusively six-figure investments, and of course rents are, you know, higher. You know I'm amazed, like, at the rents they're getting for Iron Range apartments is what I used to think of Duluth prices being, and Duluth prices are what I used to think Minneapolis prices were. The whole market is just shot up on both rents and housing costs. One person can load a taconite train with the automated chutes now, and that's not actually that new. They've been doing that for years, but I don't think a lot of people realize that even now, workers are have much higher skill sets, much higher pay, which is all good. They're much safer, also good. We like all that stuff, but there's so many fewer of them because you don't need as many if it's in this automated, safe, contained system.
Mhm.
So, you know, what does everybody else do? And they work at gas stations, they work at hotels and restaurants, and things of that nature, service sector, medical field, and some of that can't be automated. Some of it can, but those are the workers that we abuse, that both in terms of pay and benefits, but who we think little of as a society. And so, well, what do we do? Because you're basically telling people that they're not worth it, which is, I think, one of the crises of confidence, the crises of psychology that a region like the Range faces. Is, you know, when everybody could just go work in an important job and, you know, fend for a family on this one job, there is a certain ethos to that is changed. That's why people are so upset, but it has changed, and there's just no going back to it. Despite political efforts to say you can,
Mhm.
you're really doing something else, and that's, I think, what's maybe missing in a lot of the messaging is, I think you got to counter this nostalgia stuff really hard
Yeah.
and say, listen, you know, this is the new world.
I'm looking these days for housing for a man and his child,
Hmm.
and we're in Babbitt. I looked online. The closest is Evelyn or Virginia. This person is employed. There's no way he can afford that. And there is nothing in Babbitt. Even with North Shore closing, everybody in Ely is buying any available house because there's nothing at all in Ely. It's bleak. It's
Hmm. Well, if you can
impossible.
afford it, it's a logical investment, and that's what people have been doing. They've been using housing as investment, even beyond their own house, which we used to say, oh, you're investing in yourself by buying a house and improving it and then selling it at a higher price later. That's one kind of real estate growth, but we're seeing a very, very hypercharged buy, flip, or buy and Airbnb and do short-term rentals, and you can easily make enough to hold on to all this stuff, thinking that along the way here you might be able to flip that $60,000 Iron Range miner's house into a big windfall, you know, a $200,000 flip or something, um, because somebody who really wants that house is going to buy it. And so they're holding out. But yeah, I think it's a bubble. I think it is a bubble, but I don't know we're not going to like the other side of the bubble either.
Uh-uh.
So it's nothing.
Anybody who needs a vacation spot up here on Birch Lake can get one. But
Yeah.
somebody who needs a place to live because he's got a job up here
Mhm.
can't get one.
We're seeing and have been seeing for a long time a separation of the kind of people who live in the town, and then the people who live out in the country, and or what we would, our version of the suburbs in northern Minnesota is lakes, and it's a different real estate market. In the town, you see a large number of baby boomer or older homeowners, either retired, near retirement, or maybe sometimes retired for quite a while. Like they retired in 94 or something, and they're still kicking, and they've got a house that they bought in the 60s or something like that. People on fixed incomes live in them. In other words, they're on Social Security or a pension or something, and they can't really change their budget that much. And so things like taxes or insurance increases or valuation increases, which is actually right now is a very timely issue because we just got our valuation. We got a 91% increase in our county valuation. Then there's another group, your lower income service sector workers, people who can't afford a lake house, basically, and if you want to make a broad swath statement. But these are people who work at the gas stations, the Walmarts, a handful of teachers or nurses might also live in some of these houses. So in town, you've got the lower income and retired people. And as such, that's not as much buying power. That's not as much economic power. And so they're kind of ignored, I think, even though the population is still mostly in the towns. It's not a very powerful population. And then you go out in the woods and you have a mix of, rustics, working poor rustics who live in the off lake, lower tier housing market out in the woods. And then you have this whole other economy, the suburbs of the range, which is the lake homes. And Renee, it's just a slightly different economic approach. There's more disposable income. You have both Republicans and Democrats, but they tend to have more disposable income. They tend to be more engaged with politics, leadership. They tend to own businesses and things of that nature, and they live just outside of town, usually on a lake. And we got so many lakes that there's plenty of those kind of spots all over the place.
I grew up I went to Babbitt High School, and there are the people who couldn't escape. And there are a lot of them. So there are a lot of people with mental health, physical health problems. There is a huge dependent group. And so there are the children of the parents who are dying off, who have no else place to go. So they come back. And some are great and successful, but there's a whole dependency group. There are also people who they live in Chicago. They live I don't know where, but they got this big house, but they're not really here. They fly in, they fly out. They have nothing to do with any of us. Do you know that the Ely area has the most number of millionaires in the state? It's the highest per capita number of millionaires.
And then also childcare is a big issue. It's expensive it's expensive to work. It's expensive to just exist in anything you do. There's no cheap, affordable way to do anything, because I think a lot of our people would like to live cheaply, have little. If you're a couple with a kid and you want a place to live and a car, you might need two cars because two different schedules. And then you want to have a kid and raise the kid, and let's say just do hockey or something traditional with the kid. Well, expense wise, your operating expenses are higher than your income, or close to it, almost to the point where it's dead break even, and you're constantly a buck short every week. And which is just a maddening feeling, having been through it both as a kid and as and for a time as an adult, that people don't trust institutions at all. And if you come in thinking you can sell the old 70s version of liberalism's institutional support network, well, people just don't believe it. And they don't believe it for reasons that I can certainly understand, because even if you pass stuff, 2 years later, some legislator, some Congress is gonna muck it all up. Liberalism, I think, has to build from the local level, city councils and county boards and school boards for now. And we've already basically seen. You might even see a situation, and I've heard this is easier said than done, but you might even have a rural third party that absorbs the Democratic vote, and isn't attached to the broad corpus of the Democratic Party, which is culturally and economically tied to the suburbs and city. You might see a party like that, because that's what happened here. Bach and Tomassoni flipped to this vague independent status that wasn't sustainable. And so maybe it's a crazy idea, but I do think that rural Democrats just have a heck of a time, because they're just by name affiliated with, like, the Nancy Pelosi is the caricature that is the boogeyman that is used in so many ads and stuff. So if you tried to, because that's kind of what happened here 100 years ago. That's from the book. I mean, the Farmer Labor Party was a rural party first. The labor got tacked on later. It was a farmers movement first, and it was not. I mean, it was radical, but it wasn't necessarily exclusively liberal. It was kind of iconoclastic that way. It did its own thing, and it was a way for legislators in rural areas that had only exclusively elected Republicans. You could elect people not affiliated with the conservative Republican dominant party in Minnesota. We were a one-party state for, like, people forget, for like 70 years. Minnesota was completely Republican, with the exception of St. Paul and St. Cloud and a couple of German towns, New Ulm and a few others. It was a rock solid Republican state until the Farmer Labor Party kind of broke up it triangulated a new way to win elections briefly before it itself merged with the Democratic Party. But what I'd tell Jen Schultz is being smarter and better and better prepared and all of that isn't enough. Like, it should be. I get it, but it's not. And so people got to think you're on their side. It's a little bit about, identity. It's all about identity. And so that's what I'm seeing. There's a strategic way to lose that is better than a worse way to lose. And I think to lose with an eye on persuasion, with an eye toward governance and leadership and strategizing and being who you are, you can lose an election like a congressional election and still represent something that can come back and can win in the future. But there's also a way to lose in which you prostrate yourself and try to be everything to everyone and try to weasel and whine your way into a half-hearted win against an organized opponent, and then are devastated. Where it's this kind of like, we're gonna run for the electorate we wish we had, as opposed to the one we do have. And I just think, like, there's a way to build a message and a movement that is enduring beyond elections, and that will only serve to help you if you do manage to win down the line, because